Good afternoon. It's the 27th of October, and I'm really glad that the weather's nice because my neighbors are crazy, trying to tell everybody that I'm crazy when they created the diagnosis in the first place, trying to get me to move. That's crazy. And it was not government sponsored. And if it is, then let's see it on paper. Because they do everything on paper. So let's see it. I brought with me 8 books that I'm going to read to you because people are lazy and they don't read anything anymore. They just stare. So, we've got Mr. Lazy. This is going to represent the average American. The Witch Next Door, which should be renamed The Witch Across the Street. Do you know about stars? Which will be about our fascination with space, even though we've never been. Who cares? Well, I do. And I do. I've even married God to show my love of His creation. The little engine that could, because I can. The little redhead, because I do all the work. The Emperor's new clothes to represent the executive branch and all the pentagram flashers. And a fun book, which is what we'll start with, Flat Stanley. If you've not read this book, it's a wonderful book. It is by Jeff Brown. And this is how you spell my nickname. Remmy. Why would I have files on my computer with my misspelled childhood nickname? And that's not my handwriting, that's my mom's. And that one. And look at this, some brotherly love. It was my book, but he liked the story, The Emperor's New Clothes. So it says, Brian Milligan from Remy Milligan. And it's in this one that I wrote many years ago. And it's in this one. I think you get the point. The files on my computer were placed there by someone. And the police aren't interested in figuring out who the fuck did it. Somebody within Wi-Fi range. Let's start with Flat Stanley. Breakfast was ready. I will go wake up the boys, Mrs. Lambchop said to her husband, George Lambchop. Just then, their young son, Arthur, called from the bedroom. Hey, come and look. Hey. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop went into the bedroom. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, Mr. Lambchop said. Try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look. He pointed to his brother Stanley's bed. Stanley's big bulletin board had fallen on top of him while he was asleep. But Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he had gone right on sleeping until he heard Arthur shouting. "What's going on here?" Stanley called out cheerfully from under the bulletin board. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop lifted up the board. "Heavens," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Gosh," said Arthur. "Stanley's flat." "As a pancake," said Mr. Lambchop. "Darndest thing I've ever seen." "Let's all have breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Then I will take Stanley to see Dr. Dan." "How do you feel, Stanley?" Dr. Dan asked. "Does it hurt very much?" "I felt sort of tickly for a while," Stanley Lambchop said, "but I feel fine now." "Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases," said Dr. Dan. Mrs. Lambchop said that Stanley would need new clothes now, but it would be hard to find the right size. Dr. Dan's nurse measured Stanley. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms, even when the door was closed. He would just lie down and slide through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be a help, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her best ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and another pair out of his pocket. He tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied the end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She let him down between the bars and moved him up and down from side to side. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop. "What's the matter, lady?" The first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I'm not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said. "My son is at the other end of this shoelace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Just then Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up. He was holding the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned to the policeman. "A cuckoo, indeed," she said. "Shame." Yeah. The police assume things all the time. In fact, one of them stole $60 out of my fucking wallet before turning it in to the sheriff's department. "We are sorry, lady," the policeman said. "People should think twice before saying rude things, or before spreading rumors and lies that aren't true among a neighborhood and a whole entire city." And then they should not say them at all. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas, Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved to California. Thomas wanted Stanley to visit him. "Oh boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California costs a lot of money. I will have to think of some cheaper way." That evening, Mr. Lambchop brought home a very large brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try this for size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over for an egg salad sandwich. Made with thin bread, and a flat cigarette case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope, but it was still much cheaper than a train or airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. Lambchop put Stanley into his envelope. Mrs. Lambchop put in the egg salad sandwich and the cigarette case full of milk. They mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot. But once he was inside the box, Stanley straightened right up again. Mrs. Lambchop was worried because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She tapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Stanley called back. "Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get too warm, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. Then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys sent him home in a beautiful white airmail envelope they had made themselves. They wrote this end up on both sides. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out walking with him on Sunday afternoons. But it was hard when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop found that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string. Then he could carry Stanley like a package and hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. One Sunday afternoon, they met an old friend of Mr. Lambchop's, a man he had not seen for years. "Well, George, I see you have some wallpaper," the man said. "Going to fix up the house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" Mr. Lambchop said. "Oh, no. This is my son, Stanley." He undid the string, and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young fellow," the man said. He said to Mr. Lambchop, "George, that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my other son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said. "He is not always so rude." Arthur blushed and said he was sorry. Making amends. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again, and they set out for home. It began to rain. Stanley, of course, got wet just around the edges, but Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise in the living room. They found Arthur on the floor near the bookcase. He had put a great many heavy books on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed. But the next morning, they talked to Stanley. "Arthur can't help being jealous," they said. "Be nice to him. You're his younger brother, after all." Stanley and Arthur were in the park. Many boys were flying beautiful, big kites with long tails. Arthur sighed. "Someday," he said, "I will have a big kite, and I will win the kite flying contest and be famous like everyone else." Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed some string. "You can fly me, Arthur." He said, "Come on." He tied the string to himself and gave Arthur the other end to hold. He ran across the grass sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the wind. Up went Stanley being a kite.